you. Okay, everybody can hear me okay? I just want to say a couple of thank yous first, and the three thank yous are probably to the same people, but I think credit where credit's due. I want to thank Fingal County Council and Fingal Libraries for inviting me to give a talk this year. For me, this is probably the third talk in a trilogy. It's fantastic to be back with a live audience. I was here last year when I did it online, and there was nobody in here. And this is such a fantastic and magnificent venue to speak in. It needs people in it. I'd also like to thank Fingal County Council and Libraries, because the Fingal Festival of History did not stop because of the pandemic. We did it online, and then last year we filmed it. So we've been able to continue right through. And finally, I would like to thank Fingal Archives and Library, without whom I couldn't do the research that I engage in. I have been using them for the last 7 years to complete my PhD, which is about politics in Fingal between around 1860, 1870 up to 1950. What I'm interested in is what happens on the ground, what happens with people before and after the big events. And when I mentioned that this is kind of like the end of a trilogy, 3 years ago, I spoke on the role of local government in the War of Independence with a special emphasis on Fingal, Balroddery Rural District Council, Balroddery Poor Law Guardians and Dublin County Council. And last year I looked at the year 1921, and that was about the culmination of and the height of the violent and the military struggle in the early part of 1921, and the truce and the time to the treaty. And this year, as a final, let's say, installment of that revolutionary period, I'm looking at 1922, which is dominated, as Bernard said earlier, by the death of the leading politician post-1916 in Fingal, which is Frank Lawless. Now, the Civil War only briefly touches Fingal physically, but it's there in the background throughout the year, or throughout the second half of the year. But more importantly, the tensions that lead up to the Civil War are very palpable. The tensions around the time of the treaty debates are very palpable. I heard a couple of questions earlier where people said, had Frank Lawless said anything in the treaty debates? I haven't found a record either. And I haven't found a record of Jimmy Derham or MJ Derham either making any contribution, but I know the contributions that were made locally. So I'm going to begin by looking at, and most of my slides will show some of the documents that I have read and I have looked through. On the 2nd of January, while the treaty debates were still in progress in Dáil Éireann, there was a meeting of Dublin County Council chaired by Henry Friel. Henry Friel was from Donegal. He had worked with the revenue, and because he wouldn't take the oath, he was dismissed from his job. He wasn't from Dublin. He had moved to Howth. There were 19 people present at this meeting, and there was a motion passed to take no action on the treaty. There was a motion, should it be discussed. Now, the makeup of Dublin County Council at the time is interesting, because it's not necessarily local politicians. The elections in 1920 had returned a mix of local politicians, some who had been involved with Dublin County Council for a number of years, some Sinn Féin activists that had been involved on the ground, but more importantly, in terms of Dublin County Council, a number of what we might call in contemporary terms, parachute candidates, people who were handpicked by Sinn Féin's Ard Comhairle and were placed in Dublin County Council constituencies and were elected. Henry J. Friel was one of them. Another notable one was James McNeill, a brother of Hugh McNeill. And they would have been able to control what was happening. Frank Lawless was also a member. as was Patrick J. Curran from Balbriggan. PJ Curran was a member of the Labour Party. And that was the end of any discussion on Dublin County Council of the treaty. It was defeated, and therefore it wasn't raised again. The situation in Balroddery was different. This is actually the workhouse and the boardroom, which when you look at it, it's not a building you'd necessarily associate with a workhouse. This was in Lusk. The building is no longer there. This photograph was taken around 1910, 1911. By the time of this meeting, also on the 2nd of January 1922, this was partly wrecked. It had been occupied by British soldiers, the Duke of Wellington's regiment, never by the Black and Tans. It was never raided by the Black and Tans or the auxiliaries. It was regular army, but they had left it in a poor state. There was no inmates in the workhouse at this stage because they had all been moved to Drogheda and to the North Dublin Union. There were some older inmates still what we call hospitalised in the infirmary. And at this meeting, a special meeting was called to discuss the treaty, and they resolved to accept the treaty. Now, present on the day was William Ganley from Skerries in the chair, and he said he supported the treaty, and he said he didn't actually see any difference between living under a republic or living under a monarchy. And he referenced the fact that he had lived under a republic for about 30 years. He was about 70 at this time. He had gone and lived in Argentina, and Argentina became a republic in the 1860s. He was there for a number of years, and he came back. And he said, for the ordinary people, and he wasn't necessarily what I would call an ordinary farmer. He had quite a number of leases in and around the Skerries area. But he said he saw no different whether you were under a republic or you were under a monarchy. Also there at that meeting was Molly Adrian, Christopher Brown, Thomas Monks, Patrick Matthews, Gerald Brennan, Daniel Brophy and James Woods. James Woods had been interned during the War of Independence. Daniel Brophy was probably the most, I don't want to say violent, and I don't want to say necessarily progressive, but he was one of the Fingal IRA during the War of Independence who consistently called for a greater effort. Fingal was quiet in the War of Independence, apart from a number of areas, but there are some records and some, particularly in the Bureau of Military History witness statements and in the military pensions, that give indications via Michael Lynch and Michael Rock that Collins had asked that this area remain quiet, that martial law would not be declared here, because you had the camp at Gormanstown and because you needed an escape route in and out of Dublin if it was needed. Dublin City was already, during the War of Independence, a dangerous place, and a dangerous place for the IRA in which to operate. On the western side, you had the approaches from the Curragh, and you also had Royal Barracks, and you had Wellington and Marlborough Barracks, and on the south you had the mountains. So there are some indications that that was part of the reason why Dublin was quiet, or Fingal was quiet, but Daniel Brophy would have railed against that and asked for more activity and more episodes. Patrick Matthews made a comment on that day that there was this clamour to support the treaty, driven by the press. Daniel Brophy as well had accused Ganley of only calling the meeting because there was pressure from the press. Ganley obviously took exception to that. Patrick Matthews said people had to be aware of where the calls were coming from to support the treaty. It was coming from the farmers, it was coming from the ratepayers, it was coming from the press. Particularly the Irish Times was making a lot of those calls. One of the things to remember about Fingal is when we talk about 1920 and the elections, Fingal was one of the few that did not have a Sinn Féin controlled council. The Rural District Council in Fingal was not controlled by Sinn Féin. It was the only one where there was a Sinn Féin Labour 50-50 alliance. There was one nationalist who had been a previous Home Rule supporter who was returned, and everybody else was split 50-50 between Labour and Sinn Féin. So that underlying division, or that underlying difference, was there the whole time. James Woods, who was from Malahide, and again he had been interned as well, he was particularly anti-De Valera at the meeting, and he praised what he called, almost, I'm paraphrasing, the magnanimity of the English negotiators or the British negotiators in allowing the treaty to be, from their point of view, conceded. Daniel Brophy railed up at that and said it was the IRA that brought them to the negotiating table. So that very much is what was happening in that meeting in Balroddery at that time. The former Redmondite that I mentioned was Michael Dunn. Michael Dunn farmed out at the Lees, just west of Swords, and he didn't attend at all. And he wrote a letter saying that he supported the treaty. He was at a County Dublin Farmers Association meeting, which incidentally was chaired by Paddy Belton. And Paddy Belton, the Belton dynasty, the Belton family, were involved in Irish politics, I think, up at least until the 1970s. Conchius will probably know when they finished, but certainly there was Beltons in the Dáil up 80s, so even a little bit longer than I thought. So, and he referred to, and again, this is interesting because coming from Michael Dunn, who came from a Home Rule nationalist background, he said there was a dark side to the treaty, even though he supported it. And he said the dark side to the treaty was partition. So they would have had Home Rule in order to try and keep a 32 county Ireland. Ganley said that it meant self-government, but that rejection meant war. The other issues that came up at meetings at that time were the issues that had always been important to those in Fingal on the ground. The issue of the rates and what was being struck and what they were having to pay. And this came on the back of the whole set of issues with rates during the War of Independence and how they were diverted to the national cause. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, when it was passed by 64 votes to 57 on the 7th of January. Now, we know that Frank Lawless didn't speak, we know that MJ Derham didn't speak, but at the treaty debates, Richard Hayes, who had been the medical officer, now the TD for Limerick City, but who had been the medical officer in Balroddery Workhouse and had fought in the 1916 Rising, he said that the compromise was not an ignoble one, but it was a necessary one. This is a picture of those who voted for the treaty, and I'm just going to go across and I'll show you, if you see where Arthur Griffith is, and you walk back from Arthur Griffith, there is Frank Lawless there. Frank Lawless is instantly recognisable almost in any photograph. I couldn't find MJ Derham in it because I wasn't able to find a photograph of MJ Derham for this presentation. So if there's anybody from Balbriggan who knows where there's a photograph of Jimmy Derham, Frank does, I wouldn't mind. Perfect, thanks for that. So they had voted for it. In a meeting a few days later, the Sinn Féin Ord Corla met, and at that stage I gleaned from that there was 14 coming in North County Dublin, and I'll tell you what way North County Dublin voted when we look at their support for the treaty, when we look at the election in June of 1922. But just to have a brief look at the report that was given, North County Dublin was one of the most politically active areas in late 1921, based on the returns of subscriptions and membership fees at that Ord Corla meeting in 1922. And that was controlled by people like Frank Lawless and Jimmy Derham. On the 14th of January, the provisional government was set up to administer the handover from British rule to the new Irish Free State. And it was the same as the cabinet had been there before, with the exception of De Valera, Brua and Stack. So the other members stayed. The meetings that took place in Dublin County Council and in Balroddery were mirrored throughout the country. And there was only, depending on whose figures you look at, there was only either 5 or 14 that voted against. British troops left Dublin Castle on the 16th of January. And around the same time, a few days later, Collins met Craig in London to discuss the expulsion of Catholics from the shipyards in Belfast and the Boundary Commission. So what you have what's happening in almost any area. If we remember back to the Troubles in the North in late 60s, 70s, 80s, how many of us travelled to the North at that time? Okay? How many of us ended up being involved in an incident where there was a bomb or where there was a shooting? Most of us weren't, okay? So all of this is happening. It's the same with the Civil War. It's the same with the War of Independence. So when I look at what's happening in Fingal at that particular time, I'm looking at what can we get about what mattered to people. What matters to people now? We talk about the cost of living. If I go into the Georgia Street tonight, the bottom of Georgia Street, I'll see every pub is packed. So you have to kind of balance everything about what, in terms of what's happening and what's not happening. Michael Dunn, again, started to write to and bring up incidences of problems with ratepayers. Frank Lawless and Henry Friel at this stage were trying to dictate to Balroddery. They were the parent council, were trying to dictate to Balroddery at the time of what level the rate should be at. And the Rural District Council was reacting back all the time. Daniel Brophy, who argued on behalf of the IRA, did support the treaty. He never appeared at a meeting of Balroddery Rural District Council again. In early February, he went to Beggars Bush Barracks, which was the first barracks to be handed over to the Free State Army. He joined the National Army as a private. He's in the back row there. Please forgive the quality of the photograph, because I found this in a pub over near Beggars Bush, and I was so taken by it, I took a photograph just to have it, not realising at the time that there was a reflection in the glass of the lamp. This is Daniel Brophy, and he is about 8th or 9th from the right at the back. This was the Dublin Guard, who were the 1st battalion in the Free State Army. He fought with them. He had been in an active service unit of the Dublin Guards, and he was promoted in the field successively. He ended up commanding troops in Kerry, and that's a different day's work in terms of the role of the Dublin Guard in Kerry during the Civil War. But he reached the rank of Major, and when he left the army in 1924, he left with the rank of a colonel. When Craig failed to reinstate Catholic workers in the shipyards, the government introduced a policy of non-cooperation. On the non-treaty side, there isn't a lot of information about who went where. Matthias Derham and John Gaynor are reported in February for attending an anti-treaty Sinn Féin meeting. At the same time, MJ Derham, or Jimmy Derham TD, was re-elected as chairman of Balroddery Town Council. Coming them on in North County Dublin as elsewhere. And when I say North County Dublin, I'm talking, we know what Fingal is. Fingal, we're probably talking from the perimeter of the city. So we're talking probably from Artane. We're talking a line, say, from Hote to Artane, Beaumont, as we would call it now, to Finglas. So everything north of that is Fingal. But that kind of area, what's happening there is still North County Dublin at that time. Sinn Féin Ardèche on the 7th of February asked for a delay to the election that was due for 3 months and called for cooperation. And it did highlight the fact that there were economic problems at the time. At the same time, there was tensions in Limerick that led to a couple of tense standoffs over who should take over what barracks. Now, this is all in the newspapers at the time, so people in Fingal are totally aware of all of this. The Ardèche in February had a number of motions, and they were mostly counter motions. So De Valera as president had motions against the treaty, and Griffith as vice president had counter motions. It got them nowhere. In March, we start to see the tensions increasing within the IRA, within the IRB. At the same time, there are attempts to try to avoid splits. Speeches became more inflammatory, and the anti-treaty IRA started to meet and put plans in place to resist the treaty. Now, at the same time, and this is something that I have found an issue that permeates right up to about 1930. And it's one of men who had fought in 1916 and men who had fought in the War of Independence on the ground, not feeling that their effort had been appreciated fully. After 1922, we end up with winners and losers. I don't see the winners as Cumann na Gael and the anti-treaty forces. I see the winners as those who ended up with and those who ended up without. And it's very, very clear when you look at any of the evidence from beginning in this period in 1922, actually right up to when I stopped looking at it in 1948. It's a case of haves and have-nots. It is a class issue. It's farmers and labourers predominantly in North County Dublin. Throughout this, there's a lot of evidence from James Lawless, and James Lawless, Frank's brother, his experience in this time. He led a number of hunger strikes during his internment. He fought at the Battle of Ashbourne. His other brother, Ned, fought in O'Connell Street. Bernard mentioned him earlier, and that he had gone to the Boer War as well, but didn't see any action there. Bernard has covered a lot of Frank's life. I've looked at a lot of what James did. James was a town councillor in 1920 in Dublin City Council. And two of the things that he did was he had access to where telegraph cables were laid, and he passed that on to the IRA. He also had access to the vehicle licensing and registration numbers, and he gave registration numbers of vehicles that were being used by the military to the IRA, along with another couple of councillors. But he was also in and out of prison himself. There's countless accounts of him being beaten up. Ernie O'Malley has one of particularly Frank, and I think James was there as well, being beaten in Dublin Castle. And he didn't actually say anything because he was operating under an alias himself. So Dublin City Council then, with this demands for increases in wages, proposed a motion in March of 1922 to set road workers' wages at 58 shillings a week, as it had been fixed in August of 1920, and it was defeated by 7 votes to 4. Now, Frank Lawless had voted in favour of it, and an alternative motion was set, which reduced it back to 18 shillings a week with a 40% increase, because 18 shillings was what it was in 1914 before the war. The cost of living issue was there in 1922. The cost of living had gone up 120% between 1914 and 1922. A couple of days later, at another meeting, Balwadry Rural District Council sanctioned the sale of part of the Home Patrick estate in Skerries for house building. But Lord Home Patrick dug his heels in because he wanted a better price. And there was an increasing number of rows on the council over the allocation of houses, particularly between James Woods and Ganley. County Dublin farm labourers went on strike or served strike notice the same month, looking for 46 shillings a week. The farmers offered 37 shillings a week. This has resonances of what happened in 1913 in August. Before the widespread Dublin knockout, there was a farm labourers dispute, which again was briefly touched on earlier. Whilst this is happening, De Valera is making his speech about wading through rivers of Irish blood. The strikers started to disrupt cattle sales around North County Dublin, particularly one in Balbriggan. Richard Butler, who was head of the president of the Irish Farmers Congress at the time, he had the plight of farmers as his priority. He reckoned that in 1921 alone, they had lost 50 million in livestock alone, in terms of livestock that couldn't be exported or had been targeted or killed or couldn't be sold. At the time, and again, this shows some of the war being fought on the ground, and I'm talking about the class war here as well. Mrs. Rooney of Lusk, whose family had fought in 1916, wanted to run a fundraiser in the workhouse in Balroddery, and they refused because she had farm labourers on strike, and therefore they wouldn't give her permission to do that. And that angered William Ganley, and he kicked up a stink over it. The Dublin Brigade of the IRA asked, could they use Kilmainham Courthouse? And Kilmainham Courthouse at the time was in no fit state for habitation, so it was refused. We have to remember at the time that Kilmainham Courthouse was a building that was operated and administered by Dublin County Council. So you have, at this time, you have splits in the IRA, you have splits in the IRB, but in Fingal, the splits seem to be mostly between those that were in the ascendancy and those that were not. That is some of the correspondence in relation to the position of James Lawless, and he had ongoing battles about, one, him being paid for the time that he was in prison, him being paid for the time that after 1916 to the summer of 1917 and during the War of Independence, each time he was interred, that he would get paid his wages. And this battle went on for months. We know that in April, Frank Lawless was killed in an accident, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on Frank because you've heard a lot of that before, but my priority looking at Frank Lawless has always been Frank Lawless the politician. I see Frank Lawless as a politician who became a revolutionary, not a revolutionary. He was a Parnellite supporter. He set up Sinn Féin, the first Sinn Féin coming in 1906 in Swords. He was an IRB centre. I found evidence of him being one in 1908. He was a member of the Keatings and Teeling, the Keatings GAA club, as well as president of Fingalians. He's also part of the Teeling circle of the IRB, and he runs in a number of elections and is finally elected to Balroddery Rural District Council in 1914. He's elected to the County Council in 1920, and he was elected TD for Dublin County North. Despite his involvement, and again, he was quartermaster in 1916, but I see him as the leading political force in the independence movement from that period, probably around 1911, 1912. And whilst he was a member of the County Dublin Farmers Association, he was one who didn't necessarily toe the line. Just to give you an example of how the Lawlesses were viewed during the lockout in 1913, the strikers actually went and saved the harvest for Ned Lawless because of his support for them. In April, farmers and agrarian issues continue to dominate in Fingal. At the same time, and we've calls for land redistribution from labourers. We've calls for continuing the land purchase schemes that had been stopped at independence. In fact, they'd been stopped in 1914 because the British government didn't have any money during the war effort to give money to continuing land purchase. And you have farmers looking for rebates and reductions in rates. At the same time, labourers are looking for increases in wages. In Fingal, there's a slight increase then in the number of, let's say, military episodes. Sean Boylan, who was the commanding officer of the 1st Eastern Division, of which Fingal was part, his house was raided. Yes, it's the same Sean Boylan family in Dunboyne, who was the Meath manager. At the funeral of Frank Lawless, we've seen that it was the last time that a number of those on either side of the Civil War had been seen or photographed together. All 5 Dublin battalions of the IRA attended. A little bit later on, and I think this is just slightly out of sync, so forgive me, James Lawless devoted and started increasingly devoting his attention to those veterans who had fought in the War of Independence in 1916, a lot of whom, unlike him, who had managed to get some of his back pay paid, had lost their jobs, had suffered illness, had suffered sickness, whose families had suffered throughout the period, that they might have been interned in places like Ballykinler, that they may have had injuries, or where some of them have been on the run and living in very, very difficult conditions. So he increases the amount of his attention, and he was still Secretary of Dublin County Council at this time, and remained so up until the late 1920s. Kilmainham Courthouse at this time was actually broken into, and all the furniture was taken, moved into the jail, and then the British military, who were still here at the time, moved in and took over. Just to give you an example of what work opportunities were like at the time, when Dublin County Council advertised for 6 rate collectors, and a rate collector had to have a certain amount of surety or money to become a rate collector. There were 53 applications for the 6 jobs. Now, previously, you might only have got 1 or 2 applications for each position. Labour organised a strike at the time, and 75,000 workers went out on strike against a civil war, or against a potential civil war. Richard A. Butler continued to press the case of farmers and ratepayers at this time. The County Dublin Ratepayers Association was dominated by men from North County Dublin. Charles Kettle was a son of Andrew Kettle and was a brother of Tom Kettle, who died in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. P.J. Kettle was his cousin. Between them, they probably managed, maybe the family with the 2 of them at the head, about 6 or 7 significant farms in Kilmore, in Coolock, near Malahide, and in Swords. James Dickey, who farmed just east of Swords here, was also prominent, as was Paddy Belton. And Paddy Belton cut his teeth as the president of the County Dublin Ratepayers Association, and he later became a 4-time chairman of Dublin County Council. So you have all these vested interests in North County Dublin: ratepayers, farmers, and the labour movement. At the same time as you have this ideological constitutional split over the treaty. Tensions increased. William Ganley at a Sinn Féin court in May asked a question about who actually is the police anymore. So you have violence and you have people taking the law into their own hands. The disbanding of the RIC left a vacuum. That vacuum was filled by the Republican police, or the IRA police, or the Sinn Féin police. But were they pro-treaty or were they anti-treaty? So this is happening throughout the country and also is happening in North County Dublin. British and Irish delegations met at this stage because Rory O'Connor and his anti-treaty group were already since April in the forecourts, and they start putting pressure on Collins to deal with it. And then we started to see a number of incidents happening. Captain James Flanagan was shot dead in an incident with the IRA. It's unclear what happened. Was it an IRA raid on lorries or was it something else? But he was killed. The British were starting to evacuate Gormanstown camp, and they removed all the ammunition, took it out to sea and buried it in the Irish Sea, somewhere between Balbriggan and Skerries. And I can only assume that it's still there to this day. Lloyd George continued to keep putting pressure on Collins and Griffith. And at the same time, the Northern Ireland local government bill abolished PR for government elections and removed thus safeguards for the nationalist minority. There was 227 killed between the beginning of January 1922 and the end of May 1922 in the north, 87 Protestants and 150 Catholics. When the election took place in 1922, it was originally to be a packed election, that there would be a number of agreed candidates. As the election got closer, that broke down. Pro-treaty candidates won 78% of the seats when the results became known. Pro-treaty Sinn Féin won 58 seats, anti-treaty Sinn Féin 36 seats. Labour won 17 and the Farmers won 7. There were 6 independents and Trinity College kept its 4 seats. If I look just at the Dublin County constituency at the time, with its 6 seats, 5 pro-treaty candidates, let's call them Cumann na Gael, won 3 of the seats with 35% of the vote. There was 1 independent, which was Darrell Figgis, who took 29% of the vote. He was also pro-treaty. Thomas Johnson was elected for the Labour Party. He lived in Clontarf with 16% of the vote. And John Rooney, the same Rooney from Lusk that I mentioned earlier, where Mrs. Rooney didn't get permission to hold a function, he took the last seat with 7% of the vote. 91% of the electorate, or 91% of the vote in County Dublin, now I'm saying County Dublin, was for pro-treaty candidates. Michael Derham, or Jimmy Derham, was one of those that was elected for pro-treaty Sinn Féin or Cumann na Gael. So the anti-treaty vote in Dublin County was only 9%, or 1 in 10. That was Margaret Pearse, and she lost her seat. So that gives you an idea when I say how County Dublin would have voted. Now, North County Dublin would have had a small population in relation to, or a small proportion in relation to the whole of County Dublin. At this time, there was continuing reports of exceptional distress in the Balroddery Rural District Council area. Labourers had taken to going to the Rural District Council meetings and Poor Law Guardians meetings on a weekly basis. They would march from Swords, they would march from Lusk, they would march from Balbriggan and turn up at the meeting because they literally were on the breadline. And an inspector was sent out to investigate and decided that there wasn't really a problem at all. And if there was a problem, it was the problem of the council. Some councillors were resisting relief measures, particularly those that represented the farmers. Lily Fogarty, who was the Deputy Vice Chairman, a Sinn Féin Cumann na Gael activist, she wanted to provide work on the workhouse farm. Ganley called for, as he normally did in these occasions, for land redistribution for labourers. There was a view around 1921, 1922 that all ills for agricultural labourers could be solved if all the untenanted land was just redistributed to them and they were given enough land to feed themselves and have a cow and then continue to work as farm labourers, that this would sort the problem. It was never going to sort the problem, and it never did. P.J. Curran in particular said families were starving while the government was engaged in propaganda and the press was engaged in a constitutional division. All outdoor reliefs and roadworks always required the sanction of Dublin County Council. And Dublin County Council was dominated by those who had been elected as what I called earlier a type of parachute candidate. These were people who were part of the government, but working with and on Dublin County Council, as opposed to being local representatives and representing the local people. At this time, you start to see somewhat of a breakdown in Balroddery. Lily Fogarty resigned. Some of the Labour members increasingly critical and feeling powerless. One of them, Peter Kelly, following that kind of criticism from the Labour members, just never turned up again. In June, Henry Friel was re-elected chairman with James McNeill as vice chairman. And the chairman and the vice chairman, as anybody will know about meetings, they dictate the agenda. They dictate what happens. So that control is still there. On the 22nd of June, Sir Henry Wilson was assassinated in London, and Churchill gave an ultimatum to Collins to deal with the situation in the Four Courts, which they did on the night of the 27th into the 28th, when they opened fire with 18-pounder guns on the Four Courts. We've all seen some of the pictures, and I've tried to look for pictures that maybe were a little bit different. The Battle of Dublin took place between the 28th of June and the 5th of July. I haven't found anybody readily who was involved from Fingal directly in the Four Courts. That's not to say there isn't, because I tend to look more at social history and more at political history and what's happening. I haven't gone to the nth degree to find out where everybody might have been from at that particular time. Another inspector came out to Swords and he said Swords doesn't need any special treatment. Balroddery re-elected Thomas Monks and Christopher Brown, and again both of them would have been Sinn Féin, but both of them would have come from a Sinn Féin background where they would have had some level of not necessarily personal wealth, but they weren't poor. Joseph Lawless, who was mentioned earlier, had joined the Free State Army in March, and because of a disagreement he was involved in the transport section, a disagreement over how it should be run, he left. But when the Civil War broke out, his initial instinct was not to get involved, as a lot of IRA men did and had the same view. But then he thought it was probably his duty to uphold democracy. So he went and he enlisted at Portobello Barracks. Liam Lynch set up his headquarters in Limerick, and Collins assumed the Commander-in-Chief role. Now, in North County Dublin, very little happened. There was some minor mobilisation. A number of men went and joined anti-treaty IRA units. On the 3rd of July, Collins set out an order to enlist 20,000 men in the Free State Army to deal with the opposing forces in the Civil War, and that was later extended to 35,000. And what's significant as well here is the amount of ex-British soldiers, Irishmen who had been in the British Army, who were in the Free State Army. Within a week, Cathal Brugha was killed. Oscar Traynor, who had disagreed with the policy of taking buildings like the forecourts or buildings like the Hammam Hotel and the Gresham in O'Connell Street managed to escape. In Dublin, there was 65 killed, 281 wounded, and 4 million worth of damage. Kilmainham Jail was reopened together with Gormanstown and the Curragh as prison camps at that time. Harry Boland, on the 30th of July, was shot in Skerries while evading capture at the Grand Hotel, and he died a couple of days later from his wounds. He did not die, as in the Michael Collins film, being chased through catacombs in Dublin or anything like it. I know where there's some catacombs in Dublin, but he certainly wasn't in there. In August, both Griffith and Collins died and were killed. But at the beginning of August, probably the most significant military engagement in North County Dublin took place, which was the Bridges Offensive. And the anti-treaty IRA tried to cut off the city by mining and blowing up the bridges on any of the approaches to the city. So a lot of them would have been, some of them were railway bridges. There was attempts to blow up bridges at Portmarnock, the railway bridge at Portmarnock and the railway bridge at Malahide. Similar to what they had tried to do in 1916, the Fingal Battalion, they both failed. There was attempts to blow up bridges over the Tolka and bridges over the canals. 104 anti-treaty IRA were captured because they had, let's say, their plans had been communicated to the National Army. There was 4 men arrested in Finglas, 22 at Cabra, 42 at Fairview, including their commanding officer Patrick Sweeney. Balbriggan at this time is still calling for compensation. It's still calling for the restoration of jobs that were lost in the sack of Balbriggan. These are some of the things that are conveniently forgotten when we look at the narrative of the Civil War, the narrative of the end of the War of Independence, that those who have suffered remain suffering. They don't have jobs, they don't have houses, they don't have compensation. On the 22nd of August, the same day that Collins was killed, 2 Republicans were taken from a car in Drumcondra, shot dead, and their bodies were just left on the street. Eyewitnesses described men in trench coats, which was kind of like code for CID, and the National Army as being involved. On the 25th of August, Fianna Éireann members Sean Cole from Buckingham Street and Alf Colley were abducted and killed by pro-treaty forces. Their bodies were dumped in Whitehall. Brendan Daly's remains were found in St. Dula's Cemetery in Balgriffin. He was taken from his workplace. So you begin to see a sequence of tit-for-tat killings that are happening around this time. Bernard Daly, originally from Dundalk, but living in Malahide, he was taken and his body was later found. The ratepayers had written to Dublin County Council and asked that one of their members be co-opted in place of Frank Lawless, and they refused. And they probably refused because it was Patrick Belton that was proposing himself as the man who should be co-opted. Eventually, Matthew Call from North Street and Swords was co-opted, and he was proposed by PJ Curran of Labour and Michael Costello of Sinn Féin. And there's some kind of unusual little side stories to this. Joseph Kelly was the superintendent of Balroddery Workhouse in 1916, and he went AWOL. He went absent from his job in Easter week and fought in Easter week, and then he was interned in England in prison, and he came back and looked for his job back, and they gave him his job. And during the War of Independence he disappeared again to fight with the IRA, and then came back and got his job back. And on each case, he wanted to be paid for the time he was away because he was fighting for Ireland. There's always these kind of little side stories. And now he wrote to the council and said he had just joined the 1st Battalion of the Free State Army, and would they be happy to keep paying him his wages? James Rhodes hit the roof and said, we've been paying for this man to be in the army for years. And do you know what some of the background to this is? In 1914 and in 1915, some of the doctors, some of the dispensary doctors wanted to go off and serve with the Red Cross and have their wages paid, or become medical officers in the British Army. So when you see it one way and you see it the other way, you see that a lot of it comes down to what's effectively human nature. There was a number of grenade attacks took place and shootings, and Drumcondra at this time appears to be almost the centre, and particularly the bridge in Drumcondra, because you have a number of attacks on the Free State Army, you have a number of attacks on police, and you have a number of killings that seem to be centred on that area. In October, in September, the Sir Sturt Éireann Constitution of the Free State was published, and it was enacted into legislation the following month in October. Michael Neville was taken from his place of work, and his body was later found in Killester Cemetery. And in the same day, and we see here, based on this one, this newspaper report, there was 10 civilians injured in a grenade attack. John Rooney, who was now a TD in the Farmers' Party, Vice Chair of the County Dublin Farmers Association, he appealed to the local government board, again over levels of rates and high rents. So you have people being killed on the one hand, which is the civil war we know about, and then calls to deal with the economic situation at that time. On the 27th of September, following increased tensions, the government introduced the Public Safety Bill, which set up military courts and the power to execute for a number of offences, one being the possession of firearms without appropriate authorisation. I mention this as the Public Safety Bill because it was never the Public Safety Act. It was never enacted into law because at this time it would have needed royal assent. It never got royal assent. In 1923, it was retrospectively legislated for. We all know of the 77 official executions. It's probably closer to 81 or 82 on some of the later figures. One of the first to be executed was Erskine Childers. He wasn't the first. There was 4 killed before him, 4 young men, but they didn't want to make sure that Erskine Childers was made a martyr beyond what they wanted. So the other 4 were killed first on the 17th of November, and a week later Childers was executed on the 24th. This is James McNeill, who, following the resignation of Henry Friel, and Henry Friel became the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs under Kevin O'Higgins. So when I mentioned Henry Friel's background and Henry Friel's political positioning, he would have been very close to the same view as Kevin O'Higgins. James McNeill became chairman, and this is an entry from November 1922, and it was an attempt to have a debate on that executions policy in Dublin County Council, and it was just quite simply ruled out of order. There was a motion to suspend standing orders to discuss anything of a political nature, and that was defeated. So you still see the same control in Dublin County Council. It wasn't long before James McNeill himself resigned to become the Free State High Commissioner in London. Now, I've looked through this period and I was trying to find what's happening on the ground. What are ordinary people experiencing around this time? And I looked at two sets of newspaper clippings that I find are a kind of almost a contradiction and a juxtapositioning at the same time. Here we have military activity in the Dublin streets, people being stopped. We have killings. And at the same time, we have the Royal Horticultural Society flower show in Kildare Street. And we have a celebrity charity football match between the Theatre Royal and the Queen's Theatre, which takes up about a third of the page. So you have people who are engaged in these kind of activities, who are getting on with their lives, while at the same time we have a civil war. And I often think, I was going to say civil war raging, but then put that in italics and then put it in inverted commas. And you then start to see what's happening in terms of the civil war and its role in people's lives, and particularly in Fingal. And I said, well, at the outset, we're looking at a return to normality. What was normality? Well, for some people, it's whatever are the latest bargains in Cleary's at Christmas. But for normality, for the paper seller, it's trying to count, does he have enough money to have shoes? Does he have enough money to have food? Poverty is what Ireland was about in the 1920s. The damage that had been done by the First World War and the damage that had been done by that period between 1916 and 1923 continues. And I know from looking at the records that that's what's important to people. I'm just going to finish with looking at an escalation in violence. Sean Hales was killed in the vicinity of Dáil Éireann in December, on the 7th of December. And the following day, Rory O'Connor, Dick Barrett, McKelvey, Joe McKelvey and Liam Mellows were shot. Now, they weren't shot under the legislation for being in possession of firearms, because they were all arrested and captured before that legislation. Emmett Dalton actually resigned in protest at that executions policy. Effectively, in Fingal, there is no civil war. There's a couple of other skirmishes. There was another attempt on the Malahide Viaduct to blow it up, which failed. Liam Lynch was actually in the area at the time. He was in the Fitzpatrick House in the Ballymun Santry area. And a couple of weeks later, Senator John Bagwell, who was the general manager of the Great Northern Railway, was kidnapped. And there has always been speculation that Lynch may have had some involvement, but I haven't found any evidence, and I just put it down to the fact that because he was in the area at the time. Lynch himself was killed in April of 1923 in County Tipperary. So at that time, and again, that's Sean Hales there on the left, some of the divisions that were there, I'll show you two things here. Anti-Treaty IRA then put a name of those that they said voted for the murder bill, and included on it are Michael Derham and John Rooney. This photograph here probably tells us a lot about the divisions and the bitterness that was there. Rory O'Connor was best man at Kevin O'Higgins' wedding. At the wedding, Kevin O'Higgins gave him a gold sovereign and told him to sew it into his coat in case he ever might need it if he was on the run. And it was the same Kevin O'Higgins that signed the death warrant on the eve of the 8th of December that saw the execution of Rory O'Connor. I can't help thinking at times of the Civil War sometimes as a war within a war. It was a war between individuals, and it wasn't necessarily a civil war that involved the whole country. And the experience in Fingal would bear a lot of that out, that it was a political war among a political class. And what mattered in Fingal was everyday issues. What's being discussed on Balroddery Rural District Council? what's not being discussed on Dublin County Council, because it's being suppressed to an account or to an extent. And that's the experience of Fingal in 1922. Thank you.